when it comes to standards and it comes to regulation, what are you actually achieving? What are you trying to achieve? So are you simply trying to check a box, or do you want to make things better?
Welcome back to our listeners and viewers of The Responsible Edge, the podcast where we explore the bold ideas, uncomfortable truths, and unexpected solutions shaping the future of responsible business. Today, our article is Levy McAllister's sharp analysis, how CDOP and SBTI are redefining global carbon market standards, spotlighting two 2025 initiatives attempting to give backbone to carbon accountability. I have to say, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to be joined all the way from Mauritius by JJ Messner de Latour. He leads downstream due diligence at the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, and brings a wealth of global experience from Microsoft to field research in over 100 countries and testimony before multiple parliaments. JJ, it's an absolute delight to have you on the show where are we? Thursday afternoon. Thank you very much for giving up your time.
Okay, Charlie. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Top man. So look, JJ, I've both butchered your last name, obviously, and done a very poor job of giving real sort of clarity around the work that you're doing at IRMA and perhaps some of your other experiences that you're working on right now. Could you just give us a bit more kind of meat on the bone as to what you do and the organization that you work with?
Sure. So let me first talk a little bit about what I do. So as sector lead for purchasing, it means that I support one of the 6 sectors within the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA. IRMA, being a multi-stakeholder mining standard, has equal representation between a bunch of different sectors. One of those is downstream purchasers, who obviously have an interest in the provenance of the raw materials in their products. And obviously the impacts that they may have at the far upper end of the supply chain. So my job is to support the downstream purchasers in how they think about responsible mining and responsible mineral sourcing in their supply chains, and to really support them in those efforts. When I talk about downstream purchasers, I'm thinking about like the automotive sector. I'm thinking about consumer electronics, which is where my background is. I'm thinking about renewable energy, jewelry, minerals processors. Really, it could be any user of minerals that are dug out of the ground.
When you say you're working with with these downstream partners, if you like, what does like a typical like piece of work look like for you? Like what are you doing in order to support them in thinking about and being clear about responsible sourcing of minerals, et cetera, as you've described? Like what are your initiatives that you're working on?
How long you got? So I mean, I think one overriding element is looking at a standard like IRMA. We have 103 mining companies that are in the system right now across 53 different minerals. And the vast majority of those companies are going through the IRMA assurance process, largely at the behest of downstream purchasers, because it is that customer interest in ensuring that the materials in their products, whether they be cars, phones, wind turbines, computers, rings on your finger, whatever they are, meet a certain minimum standard. And the thing about supply chains is they're long and complex. And for many of the companies that we work with, most of them indirectly source these raw materials. Mm-hmm. So not only are they under various pressure, whether it be their own customers, whether it be investors, advocacy groups, shareholders, their own leadership, whomever it is, regulatory agencies may have all kinds of expectations as to the due diligence that they perform on the materials in their products, but yet for most of them, they don't actually source directly from the mines. So we do a lot of work on outreach to the mining sector on behalf of downstream purchasers. We do a lot of thinking about how to get suppliers on board, how to cascade those requirements through the supply chain. But then we think about it the other way around as well, which is the traceability element. Once downstream purchasers have gone to all the effort to get mines in the system and to undergo IRMA assurance, how can they then make claims that they are sourcing from IRMA audited mines? And so we also work on chain of custody, we work on traceability, but also we recognize that there's a lot of folks in this space. And so we're looking at how we partner, how we integrate, how we streamline, because we just work with industrial mining. However, artisanal and small-scale mining is a big part of the equation. So how we partner with organizations like the Alliance for Responsible Mining that specialize with ASM. We only focus on the mining part of the supply chain, but yet we've got processes to think about. And so that's why we partner with the Responsible Minerals Initiative, who specialize in smelters and refiners. So, that part of how we scale with partners, how we reduce duplication, how we make life easier, honestly, for the supply chain to be able to implement the very standards and expectations that we are expecting is a big part of the job.
It sounds like you've got a hell of an in tray there, JJ. You've got a lot on your plate. Let me ask you how we got here. So, you sort of slightly titillated to your previous experience as well and where you've come from. But take us back to the beginning, wherever you want to start. What has ultimately led you to this? Like, what's inspired you as a younger man that's sort of driven you throughout your career? Can you pinpoint any particular formative experiences for us?
Well, yes. So if you were to ask my parents, they fully expected me to be a lawyer in Australia. And clearly I've checked neither of those boxes. However, I did try. I did start down that road. However, I think I suffered a bit of an early career crisis where I gained enough exposure to law. I worked for a corporate antitrust law firm for a while, which also had a sideline business in tobacco lobbying, and worked with great people. But at the end of the day, I realized that this was not really for me. I really didn't want to spend my life helping, one rich bloke fleece another rich bloke, and it just didn't sit well with me. And so I decided that I wanted to have a bit of a change. But then the next question is, well, what's that change going to be? And so I thought, what is it that actually makes me excited? What is it that keeps me interested? And I have always had a real interest in not only, politics, but international affairs. I mean, when I was a little kid, I built a Legoland that had an East Legoland and a West Legoland with a wall down the middle. So, really clearly impacted me from a young age. I wrote my first letter to the Prime Minister when I was, I think, about 7 years old, and my grandfather actually posted it for me. I got a reply. I mean, auto reply, but got a reply.
What did you request, or what did you suggest to the Prime Minister at the age of 7? Can you remember?
Well, I like to think that at the age of 7, I was probably giving the Prime Minister some kind of commentary on fiscal policy, but chances are it was probably just a drawing of the Prime Minister. But all that to say that, I've always had that interest in politics and international affairs. And particularly during the time that I was going through university in Australia, a really big issue was East Timor, the Indonesian occupation of East Timor. And the following independence referendum, peacekeeping operation, which was heavily dominated by Australia and New Zealand, and so that was always an interest area of mine during university. And so I thought, peace and conflict is really interesting, and I feel like it's an opportunity to help people. And so I set my sights on working in peacekeeping. I actually went back to grad school and did a master's degree in, of all things, peacekeeping operations.
Wow.
And that actually led me into, of all things, defense contracting. And so I joined an organization which was called the International Peace Operations Association. And it was born at a time where private contractors were supporting UN peacekeeping operations in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, places like that. But that then exploded, of course, with the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. And so IPOA was, it was a trade association of defense contractors that were supporting these international peacekeeping operations, or stability operations, as you may call them. But they were doing so in a fairly unrecognized and unregulated space. And you had a number of these contractors who realized that they really needed a path to legitimacy. And that path to legitimacy was creating some kind of industry standard that they could all get behind. So one of my jobs early on at IPOA was overseeing the industry code of conduct for defense contractors in stability operations, bringing in other stakeholders to work on it and to bring their perspectives, and ultimately to try and raise standards in the industry, because it was getting a lot of, at times very justified, negative public blowback.
But you're working with the defense contractors themselves, who are essentially, aiding in many ways but you're coming up with pragmatic collective solutions. How was that for you in terms of just that kind of, moral dilemma, if there was anything there, or perhaps just clarity around, we live in a realistic world. This is how you enact change, is you need to work with these organizations. Just talk us through that.
I mean, I've always thought of myself as fairly pragmatic, and yeah, I mean, there's no other way around it than saying that it was a very challenging time. There were a lot of public blowback. There was there were incidents that were really quite disturbing that happened during that time. And I mean, I think that there's a couple ways that anyone can approach that sort of situation. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, but one is to sort of campaign work against the thing from occurring in the first place. Perfectly sound. The other is to recognize that the thing is not going away. So how do you reduce the negative impacts and try and make it better? And so that's the more pragmatic path that I followed, because I felt that even if I thought that industry did not have a place in modern life, if it did not have a place in these scenarios, that it should just go away. Well, I can't affect that. So what I can affect, however, is how it operates, how that policy gets implemented. So that's the path I chose. And so that dragged me into an initiative called the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights that I worked on for the best part of a decade. And around the sort of periphery of the voluntary principles, I worked in civil society in support of that initiative, but also working with mining sector clients, oil companies, ports, infrastructure, transportation, all kinds of different operations to figure out their security and human rights policies and practices, with the intention that they reduce the harm for communities that are situated around them. That got me into mining, and it's a fascinating industry. It's truly like no other. It powers our lives. It's everywhere around us. Everything that we consume is either mined or farmed, and so at some point it's come out of the ground. And I think that, societally, we don't really think about it so much. If you look at your phone, you're not really thinking about the lithium, the nickel, the cobalt, the graphite in the battery. If you look at your car, you're not really thinking too much about, the steel or, again, those same battery materials or alloys or whatever, right? Who thinks about where the rubber in their tires comes from? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, or buildings, roads, thinking where sand and aggregate comes from. And so it is inextricably such a core part of our lives. And it has so much power to build and enrich society, but at the same time, it has so much power to disadvantage communities who are directly impacted by it. And so it's an industry that I think contributes so much to modern society, both positive and negative, and the differences between different communities, different locations, really means that every single mining project is different. It's unique. It has its unique challenges. It has its unique characteristics, and so it's an industry that also we often talk about as if it's just this collective whole, whereas in actual fact, it's hundreds of individual commodity supply chains, each with their own geographical characteristics, each with their own unique idiosyncrasies. And so that, I think, makes it truly fascinating.
Let's move forward now. I know that was a whistle-stop tour through you. I know we haven't even touched upon areas of your career, but as I said, we'll link to your LinkedIn profile so listeners and viewers can go and check out the depths and the details of things. For now, though, would you mind moving forward onto this week's article and perhaps just providing a bit of a summary and overview for our listeners, and then perhaps picking out whatever you thought was most interesting in the piece?
So the article that we're looking at is how CDOP and SBTI are redefining global carbon market standards. And I fully caveat this by saying that carbon is not my strong point. I would say that when I was in the consumer electronics sector, I was Scope 3 adjacent, I think is the most accurate way of putting it. I wouldn't say it was top of my pile, but what I found in this article was real parallels that you can take away so many lessons and ideas, I think, for voluntary industry standards on pretty much everything. Because I was looking at that article and I was thinking, that's just like it is for us in responsible mining. That's just like it is, for everything else that we do. And so, yeah, we're going to be talking about an article about carbon, but I think if you look at it as an article about carbon, you actually miss a lot of the point. So first of all, what is CDOP? So CDOP is the Carbon Data Open Protocol. SBTI is Science-Based Targets Initiative. Both of those are initiatives that fundamentally between them are really taking sort of the aspirational element of sustainability and sustainability practices within corporate, within supply chains, and making them real. I mean, they're making them auditable, they're making them science-based strategies, and they are presenting the concept of carbon reduction in the supply chain as something that can actually be implemented. Because it's one thing to be able to say as a company that, we will be carbon neutral or carbon negative by 2030. But at some point, somebody, actually it's going to be a lot of somebodies within the company, is actually going to have to implement that. And to implement it, they're going to need data. They're going to need their baselines. They're going to need to figure out, where carbon exists in their supply chain, where there are opportunities to change, how they're actually going to get to that target. So this is actually really important stuff because, it's very easy, I think, for, a CEO to get on stage or for a company to publish a sustainability report that makes these grand aspirational visions, which is great. I mean, you need those, but you also need a pathway to be able to execute them. And I think that's what is really key about what this article is talking about and what these initiatives are trying to do.
Kind of elephant in the room sort of question, if you like, for especially, I think, for your experience, this is going to be fascinating. But are we generally letting like voluntary standards sort of do the real job of regulation? Are we ultimately just got a load of policymakers around the world that are just basically, running essentially populist governments and just nervy about making policy or putting policy in place that's tricky and difficult? Is that the scenario that and I know that's a huge generalization, but is that something that you see playing out in the world?
I mean, it really depends how you look at it. And it's a little bit, cart before horse sort of scenario, because in my view, at least, voluntary standards exist because of a regulatory vacuum. And there are others, however, who might argue that there's a regulatory vacuum because there are voluntary standards. But I don't think that that's true. And voluntary standards, fundamentally are filling a gap, because you look at IRMA, for example. Ideally, maybe in a perfect world, we wouldn't have a need for a standard like IRMA, because regulation would be at a level that is protecting communities, that is protecting workers, that is protecting the environment in a way that high bar voluntary standards are not actually necessary. But we don't live in that world. And so the reality is that voluntary standards can be a very powerful tool in being able to ensure that, in this case, responsible mining takes place, or in the case with SBTI and CDOP, that carbon reduction is taking place. But I would also asterisk that by saying that I don't think it's unreasonable to think that regulation should be better, should be stronger. But also, I think that that argument rests upon the supposition that regulation would be high bar. And I think that we often see, we're seeing it in the European Union right now, right? That you see legislation or regulation that starts off very, very highly aspirational, and then as that sausage is made, it turns out to be something quite different at the end, because everybody has an interest, which is fair. Those voices should be heard, but the problem is, at the end of the day, that being mandatory regulation, I think, has to cater to many of those interests, and obviously there's political realities as well. Whereas a voluntary standard, yes, there are market forces, there might be investor demands, there might be customer expectations, whatever, but no one's forcing companies to do them. And so there is that flexibility that voluntary standards have in being able to be a little bit more high bar and a little bit more aspirational. Because I would also go back to another fundamental question, and this gets to due diligence as well, is when it comes to standards and it comes to regulation, what are you actually achieving? What are you trying to achieve? So are you simply trying to check a box, or do you want to make things better? And so I think that's the logic behind IRMA, that it is intended to be a standard that facilitates transformational change over time. Mm-hmm. And from a downstream purchaser perspective, when I was in consumer electronics and responsible sourcing, my view towards supply chain due diligence in this sense, relying on voluntary standards, was, on one hand, I obviously want to know what my supply chain risk is today, but I also want to make sure that the standards that I'm requiring of my supply chain are facilitating a scenario where that risk today is going to be less tomorrow, because that's in my interest, it's in my stakeholders' interests. And so when we think about high bar standards and we think about the flexibility that voluntary standards provides, that is actually a very powerful tool, because it gives that flexibility to take us from simply a checking the box exercise, just checking off the status quo, to actually creating better outcomes. And I think that is what is really sort of the quietly powerful part of voluntary standards done right.
Is there almost an argument for like having things work in sort of there be a clear relationship between voluntary standards and regulatory frameworks, in that you're always going to have the voluntary standards, as you've just alluded to, kind of continue to push the boundary, if you like, of what best practice can look like and what, organizational change can look like in terms of behavior. And that what you want is regulation to just sort of continue to grow sort of behind it almost, taking what was part of perhaps the voluntary standard previously that's now extended and gone beyond and set a new standard of best practice. That's almost sort of regulation catches up with that. And that actually we want a relationship between the two, so that there's almost that sort of stick and carrot, if you like, moving along a continuum of best practice. Have I oversimplified that, or is that an interesting way of thinking about the relationship between the two?
No, and actually I would say that there already is in many ways that sort of dynamic, in the sense that you can have voluntary standards that we ensure that they align with certain regulatory expectations. So, in the latest iteration of the IRMA standard, every several years we update it. We're currently in the public consultation period for version 2 of the standard. Part of our remit in that standard revision is to make sure that we're aligned with current regulations, latest international conventions, all that sort of thing. So, we can tell stakeholders that, IRMA is aligned with CSDDD, or IRMA is aligned with the EU battery regulation. So you do see that alignment, and we do spend a lot of time thinking about it. Mm-hmm. I think it is largely it tends to be a one-way street. You see obviously the voluntary standards, and it might be logical, right? That you see the voluntary standards aligning with regulation more than you see regulation aligning with voluntary standards. But, we also, could see in the future, maybe certain countries' mining codes could factor in voluntary standards for certain things. Not in a way of outsourcing regulation or anything like that, but really avoiding reinventing the wheel, and also creating standardization from one country to another, because that's another issue, right? That if you have a mineral supply chain, if you're sourcing from 50 different countries, that could be 50 different mining codes, and so some level of standardization could be helpful there. So, I do think that there is opportunity for that. I think a lot of the opportunity is still sort of waiting, but for sure, I don't think we need to think of regulation of voluntary standards as siloed apart from each other either.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, what you've just described there, I just reflect upon the work that we're doing at the Anti-Greenwash Charter and the relationship that we have with, in the UK, both the Green Claims Code and in the EU, the Green Claims Directive. And you're right, like we've very much kind of taken a lot of inspiration from those codes and those frameworks. And then we've almost gone on to say, well, what else could be done? And there's almost a receptiveness of our signatories that are obviously engaging with this as a voluntary standard to go, we want to go beyond regulation. We want to be able to present the fact that we've gone beyond regulation and implemented an even higher standard of practice, if you like. So there's definite sort of value, perhaps. And I'd love to know how this applies to IRMA. There's definite value in organizations that see that whole narrative around going beyond regulation. Is that something that plays out with IRMA as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And, one learning that we've had from a number of the mining companies that have gone through the IRMA process is, at the beginning, like when you're building your program to comply with a specific standard, you're going to be audited. There's obviously going to be a temptation to think that you're sort of revising for the exam, as it were. I think that's just natural. But for companies that have gone through the process, we find very often that they come out on the other side thinking less about IRMA being an audit, which it is, and thinking more about it as, to quote, a roadmap to operational excellence, because what it's really doing is it's making better businesses. Because you can look at a standard and think, oh, these are just the boxes that we need to check. Yeah. But if you take a bit more of, if I can say, an enlightened view, what it's doing is it's giving you a structured way of looking at your business and figuring out where the risks exist, and not taking for granted that you necessarily have factored in all those risks. Maybe there are things you haven't thought about, or you haven't thought about them in that way. And so it really gives an opportunity to take those corrective actions and close those gaps. And if you're closing those gaps, you are inherently creating a better business, because you're reducing your risk. You are, and risk to you, risk to your investors, risk to your customers, and importantly, risk to impacted communities and workers.
What are the kind of values and benefits that organizations that go through the IRMA process get from a reputational perspective?
Well, I spoke about the sort of the business elements of, being better businesses. But I think two key drivers that we're seeing are, one, access to market, because increasingly downstream purchasers are asking for IRMA in their supply chains, either directly, where they might have direct offtake agreements, or cascading that expectation through their supply chain. And so I think we are, it's different from one mineral to the next, particularly in terms of market coverage, but I think that we are moving closer to that point where, IRMA becomes sort of table stakes for certain mineral supply chains, but also access to capital. I was at a conference earlier this year where an investor said to a room full of mining companies that, from his perspective, the mining sector was too risky for his company to invest in. Mm-hmm. And the point that he made was, over the next few decades, we're going to have to mine more materials than we have in all of human history. To be able to do that, you're going to need capital. You need capital to build mines. And if as an industry you don't have the transparency, you don't have the ability to mitigate risk to the levels that investors hope, then where you're going to get that capital from. So it was a really, really powerful point that was made, and I think it really gets to that broader question of how are mining companies going to benefit from this. I often hear from mining companies, oh, well, we're going to get a premium for our materials. I mean, it's a fair question, but I also think it kind of misses the point, because you might be left without a market. You might be left without investors. So at that point, whether you're getting, another 1 cent a kilo for your material is sort of immaterial if you don't have a mine to produce. And so I think that's more of a longer term sort of evidentiary case that hopefully will present itself.
I've got loads more questions that I want to follow on with you, but producers' concerns in mind. We'll now move on to the magic wand question, which I'm fascinated to see what you're going to do with it. JJ, if I was to hand you a magic wand, you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant. What would that one thing be?
Can I get two?
Oh, in fact, you're the second guest I've had this week that's naughtily asked for two. But yes, go on. You've been great, so have two.
I mean, what I could do is give you both and pretend they're one. So maybe I do that. Okay.
I love the transparency. Go forward. Go for it.
So I think, one is greater investment in supplier capacity, because I think that there's just this often at times an expectation that, whether it be societal or whether it be as brands, there's just this expectation that, we write something into a contract and magically the supply chain will just change. But there is a need to bring suppliers with you. There is a need to build their capacity for them to get to where you need to be. Often in supply chain, when we think about risk, we we think about like excluding suppliers. So if a supplier presents a certain risk, whether it be reputational, legal, regulatory, whatever, let's just get them out of the supply chain as fast as possible. But what that forgets is that they just then become somebody else's problem and the issue doesn't go away. So how do you reorient supply chains away from that sort of knee-jerk exclusionary paradigm to instead work with suppliers to bring them into conformance? And I know that that sounds hard, and there's maybe not an immediate financial upside to doing that, but I think we forget that supply chains are not siloed. Like there's, each company does not have its own bespoke supply chain. Everybody shares suppliers, and your problem is my problem is your problem. And so I think if we start thinking in that ecosystem way, then maybe we start to see the change in supply chain that we all want. The other thing I would say, and this is where I cheekily have my second magic wand, is to normalize sustainability and responsible sourcing, because I so often see it as a bolt-on added extra rather than a core part of what we do. A few decades ago, there was the safety revolution where everyone realized that like occupational health and safety was a big deal and we needed to take it seriously. And I think, companies still have their safety officers, right? They still have their safety teams, but it's seen as a core part of the business.
Yeah.
And I think that sustainability and responsible sourcing really needs to follow that path of occupational health and safety, which is it's a core part to good business, because sustainability and responsible sourcing, it can impact cost, it can impact continuity of supply, it can impact supply chain resiliency, reputation, legal exposure, access to market, access to capital. Like it can impact so many things. And so to think of it as this add-on, I think really misses the point. It misses an opportunity, and it also, I think, creates a culture where you're actually taking something that's really core to business and operational long-term success and treating it as a bit of a consumable or a bit nice to have. And I think that is the other magic wand that I would wave.
When it comes to sustainability and responsible sourcing, as you've described, is there any concern around sort of the lack of permanency, perhaps, of that side of a business as opposed to something like health and safety, which is it's something that we now we learned, we observed, we realized that actually this was going to be core and fundamental forever, and that it was something that was permanent and needed to be permanently factored in. When it comes to sustainability and responsible sourcing, are we not ultimately working towards a world where everyone is operating responsibly, everybody is working sustainably, and therefore almost it becomes a sort of it becomes a flash in the pan? Is that at all a relevant or a warranted observation, or is that misconstruing the way that responsible sourcing and sustainability are going to develop over the course of the next few decades?
Well, maybe they need to be a flash in the pan in thinking of them separately and thinking of it as somehow new. And then they, just like occupational health and safety, I think, did in a way, they need to evolve to just become your basic business functions, that it's just part of what you do. Let me give you an example. So, think about who actually has to implement this stuff. Oftentimes it's a sourcing organization, right? Mm-hmm. That is responsible for, sourcing the parts, sourcing the materials, working with suppliers. And what do sourcing engineers get appraised on in their annual reviews, right? It's cost, quality, timeliness. There's not really much else. Like, have you gotten the parts delivered on time? Do they meet spec? Do they, and did you get them at or below budgeted cost, right? That's it.
JJ, thank you so much for today. I know that was a whistle-stop tour, but I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts with us. It was fascinating. Thank you.
It was a pleasure, Charlie. Anytime.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to my guest, JJ Messner de la Tour, whose global expertise around the mining sector and whether or not responsible mining is something that is plausible and possible was absolutely fascinating to unpick. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the independent mark of integrity for sustainability reporting. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.